The first time I took a drug, I was 8 years old. By age 13, I was shooting up
Right.
and I had 15 years of addiction, most of it completely hidden, right? So even with all the resources that I had social support, I had family support, I had financial support. It still took me a really long time to get to a place where I could stay in recovery.
This is the Knockin' Doors Down podcast, featuring celebrities, experts, and everyday people who have overcome adversities, including addiction, mental health, and trauma, to live purposeful lives. And that's what Knockin' Doors Down is all about. On this episode, I'm speaking with Erin Khar. She's the author of Strung Out. It is her debut memoir, and it is just a phenomenal book. I highly recommend you pick up a copy of it. It's honest, it's true, it's authentic. Erin had to tell her story of childhood trauma and how she fell into using heroin at the age of 13. Erin also does amazing writing with her Ask Erin column. She talks addiction, recovery, mental health, parenting, relationships, and so much more. Erin's established herself as a respected voice in our national conversation about the overdose epidemic. We not only touch on her story, we talk harm reduction and what we think can actually be done to curb the overdose death rate in the United States. It's a true pleasure to know Erin, and I'm glad she used this platform to share her purpose. Speaking of purpose, how about a lifestyle brand with purpose? 5150 LTM. That's right. Not only is it a lifestyle brand that can fit whatever it is you're trying to achieve in life, but they give back to the community. Right now, I am wearing my new 5150 hat, warm weather jacket. As well, I got my new 5150 joggers on that I like to wear around the winter time. And you, the listener of Knockin' Doors Down, get 20% off every time you shop at 5150 LTM. All you have to do is use the code KDD20 at checkout and get 20% off. And of course, I said it helps within the community. And how does 5150 give back to the community? Portions of the sales benefit the Carlos Vieira Foundation. Their three amazing programs, the Race to End the Stigma, which focuses on mental health, the Race for Autism, helping families in the community who have children that have special needs and are on the autism spectrum scale, and the Race to be Drug-Free, providing free after-school athletic programs to the youth within our community, keeping them off the streets, away from gangs and drugs. More on the Carlos Vieira Foundation, go to carlosvierafoundation.org. Erin Khar, the author of Strung Out, Last Hit, and Other Lies That Nearly Killed Me. Thanks for joining me on Knockin' Doors Down.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I am loving the book, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. So much stuff to go through. I mean, learning that you have, Persian descent and all these things that when we had spoken separate of this podcast, I was like, wow, I didn't know that. But such a fascinating story, your story. What are you finding, as of this recording, we're facing the holiday season and you have your
Mhm.
wonderful column, excuse me. I was just having a bagel and a schmear before we got on here. Ask Erin, are you getting a lot of people that are really struggling this time of year?
I mean, I think it's a hard time of year for a lot of people for different reasons. I mean, for people who may be estranged from their families, for people who are going home to see family members and they might have like really toxic family dynamics. I get a lot of questions around the holidays about people who are newly sober and having anxiety about navigating either family functions or just holiday parties in general. That's a
Right.
question I get frequently. And then the other thing that comes up a lot is sort of like just anxiety about um, talking to people about why they're not drinking or just that they have this messed up family dynamic.
Right. Yeah, let me ask your advice on that because I
Sure.
went through that. I did the big explanation of the not
Mm-hmm.
drinking. My primarily DOC, drug of choice. I know you're a little bit different for
Right.
sure, but how do you kind of advise people to navigate that?
I mean, I think that it's an individual thing, but I think that if you feel comfortable talking about it, you can tell people that you didn't feel well when you drank.
Yeah.
Or that, when you drank, you found that like your life was worse. Or if you don't really want to talk about it, it's not really anybody's business. I mean, you can just say like, I don't really like alcohol. I don't
Yeah.
like what alcohol does to me. Any of those sorts of answers. I mean, I think that like it's not uncommon for people not to drink right
Mhm.
now. I think that you'll often find um, that there may be people not drinking for a variety of reasons. What happens sometimes in families where there are a lot of other heavy drinkers, I think it sometimes puts other people's, it sort of like they might have a reaction to it because they feel uncomfortable about their own drinking. Because I found that when I was newly sober, people felt like they had to explain their own drug and alcohol use to me. I'm like, I could care less what your drug and alcohol use is, you know? So I think it's like, giving an honest answer. There's also the option that was sort of like always an old standby for people to just tell them that you've developed an allergy to alcohol.
That's a good one. I've actually said that because if I break it down, it's true. Like my line ended up becoming one guy goes, "Really? What happens?" I go, "Yeah, I break out in handcuffs."
Right,
You
right. I
know?
mean, and truthfully, there are people, alcohol was never my drug of choice, but like I was never really a part of my story, but I never was good with red wine because I actually physically had like a physical allergy to it, like with sneezing. So, I mean, there's all different sorts of ways to address that. I feel like the allergy line, just saying like, I'm allergic. What are they going to say to that? You know
Yeah,
what I
right.
mean?
Right.
And then I think also like if you're at a more sort of like work related or social function where you don't know the people as well, it's very easy to get a drink from
Mhm.
the bar that looks like a cocktail.
Mhm.
This is a really stupid example, but I was watching this reality show Below Deck,
Oh,
and
good God.
the captain is not an alcoholic, but he doesn't ever drink on charter. So if he dines with the guests, that he has apple juice with like a large ice cube so it looks like whiskey, or he'll have just like seltzer with lime, but it looks like like a gin and tonic or vodka tonic. And because it's otherwise guests get really pushy, even though he's like, it's not because he's not doesn't drink socially, it's just he doesn't drink on charter. Otherwise guests will ask him, like, oh come on, just have a little drink, so he
Right.
just pretends he's drinking.
Yeah.
That's not the right strategy for everybody, but sometimes it's easier for people to feel like they have something that looks like an alcoholic beverage. The good thing is that now there's been such a huge movement with sort of non-alcoholic cocktails. There are non-alcoholic bars in New York City. You know, Various people have different reactions to that. Some people, don't feel the need for like a mocktail. Some people like it because then it just still feels kind of like a special celebratory drink.
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways to navigate that.
Yeah, for me, I found, I've had talks with so many different alcoholics about like non-alcoholic beer doesn't trigger me. A mocktail
Right,
doesn't trigger me. And if I am out and it is a thing, I do exactly what you're talking about.
right,
The tonic water with the lime,
right.
people leave me alone. But I think that's the part of the recovery process that
Yeah,
it's like, this works for me. Oh, will it work
totally.
for me? I don't know.
Right.
It might trigger you. For me, it doesn't.
Right. I mean, there are people that won't eat like desserts that have alcohol in them,
Sure.
but I never found that. I mean, I just again, it wasn't my I never ever had problematic drinking, so I don't have that reaction to alcohol. So if I have like, there's alcohol in my tiramisu, it does not I'm not like, oh, now I want to drink,
Right. Well, speaking of the family navigation, I believe I'm on chapter 7 of your book
Hmm.
now. And so there's a lot of really interesting nuances with your childhood, your folks. Um, the first one I want to ask, because I've had several friends that were Persian too, and
Hmm.
one of the hard things for them was much like you, your dad is talking to your grandma in Farsi
Hmm.
and you don't understand. Was there ever
Hmm.
anything that made you not being able to communicate in that way and isolation?
I mean, my father he only really spoke to his siblings and parents in Farsi, and he had one friend who was also Persian. But my dad was one of those people who like came to the US in the late 60s to go to college, and he never went back, and really assimilated, identified as American. And, in some ways, I feel like I didn't get a lot of sort of the same sort of exposure to Persian culture the way that other Persian Americans I know did, because there was so much assimilation. And I don't know if that was, his own desire to sort of just fit in. But I mean, I didn't, I don't know that it added any more to that sense, but certainly, you always wonder if people are talking about you and they're speaking another language.
Right. See, Mike, so when your dad left, that wasn't when the stuff with the Shah and all that was going down in Iran, right?
That
He
was
left
way
pre that.
before. He left about over 10 years before, like
Okay.
maybe, yeah, he left like 15 years before that happened. Like like 13, 14 years before that
Okay.
happened. And actually, I think the majority of my father's family was already living in Europe and the US. So yeah. But certainly when all of that happened, I was a small child, and I remember there was so much like anti-Iranian sentiment.
Right.
And I remember that very clearly.
Yeah, I was gonna. That was kind of my inquiry, was if there was the family trauma, thus generational trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of the work that you do, and you're very out there about it. It's like, hey, sorry, societal traumas, family traumas,
Mm-hmm.
generational traumas, all this stuff is real,
Oh yeah.
and so many people don't believe me when I say bullshit. No, it's real. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
curious if that had played in. So
I mean, I definitely think that like I grew up in a really very, very white neighborhood, very, very white school. Like I was like the token ethnic friend. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I said not that my
right.
friends were fine, but it's just I definitely, obviously I had all the benefits of white privilege in the
Sure.
world, but I still at the same time was other, right?
Mm.
So I I I think that for anybody who has like mixed ethnicity or mixed race, that there is a little bit of like you're kind of straddling more than one world and
Right.
kind of don't really fit in either.
Right.
Which is not, unique to me. And certainly, like I said, I mean, I had plenty of privileges. But I didn't, I definitely was aware of the fact that, the question that I always got is like, where are you from? Los Angeles. No, but like, where are you from? Or,
Right.
being called exotic, which my answer was always like, I'm not a plant. You know what I mean?
I'm not some kind of bird or
Yeah.
something.
It's like I hate it when people use that to describe somebody who's like not white.
Right.
You're very exotic.
So are some cars. I don't
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
Uh,
So yeah, I mean, I think that, and obviously the same sort of neighborhood that I grew up in is much more diverse now. It was, 10 minutes outside of downtown Los Angeles, but it was a very sort of waspy neighborhood.
well, yeah, I mean, you talk about that, and one of the interesting things for me, and I kind of felt this. I grew up in the home of addiction. My dad
Mm-hmm.
was. That you got kind of presented to was your dad's way of sometimes showing love was the purchasing of gifts. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you did equestrian, and you got
Mm-hmm.
a car, I believe a
Yep.
Jeep, before you were 16, and
Yeah.
before you were even 18, an apartment rented for you, and all these
Mm-hmm.
things. And I'm kind of seeing that in a personal situation, not on my hand, but it's so detrimental.
It is, and it's not, it's like it doesn't come from a malicious place, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that like, I think it's not uncommon for when there's a divorce. It's not uncommon where one parent is maybe working a lot and they feel guilty, and it's a really easy way to sort of band-aid a situation. And I think that it's a twofold thing. Like number one, like on a subconscious level, I think I equated love with money.
Mm-hmm.
And so if my dad ever said no to something, I felt like a very like outsized reaction to it because it felt like some sort of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other side of it is that I really manipulated him in a lot of ways um, to get what I wanted. And I think that, not just in financial situations, but in general, when people have that sort of manipulative behavior, I always say that it's born of a place that they don't trust that they're going to get what they want or need unless they manipulate.
Right.
And that's not to excuse the behavior. It's just, but it's an explanation. I mean, this doesn't come out of a vacuum. It doesn't come out because people want to hurt other people or be malicious. It's generally because they don't trust that they're going to get their needs or wants filled.
Yeah. Well, it's that wise brain that we start to develop from all the stuff we take in as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
don't you think?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, yeah, it becomes this is how needs are met. And especially us that are in trauma mode, survival mode,
Mm-hmm.
we will do any and everything to keep that going because that's the only story we know.
Right. Right. I mean, I definitely, like I believed that I was shown how much I was valued or loved through what I was given
Right.
because, my parents had their own they had their own backstories and their own histories and their own stuff going on and did the best they could. And I have a really good relationship with both of them now, but I didn't feel protected as a child. I didn't feel like I could trust them with anything that happened to me or was going on with me. I felt like, okay, like at a really early age, I was like, okay, Erin, you're going to have to figure this out. And it was exactly that. It was so much about like survival and protecting myself.
Yeah. You do such a great job. I think it's chapter 2 where you're really kind
Mm-hmm,
of digging in with your mom and one of her boyfriends at the time, and
mm-hmm,
you just whatever it was, this guy, and it was like your mom negated your feelings.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that at the time it was devastating, right? The greatest gift my mom gave me is that when we went to therapy a couple of years later, um, she allowed me to tell her how I felt and validated those feelings. Now, our relationship still had, we still had our ups and downs after that, but I've had that in the forefront of my mind the entire time I've been a parent because that my mom apologized to me and validated me and acknowledged how hard that must have been was huge.
Yeah.
Huge, huge, huge. And I give her so much credit for that because it's really challenging, as parents, 100%, like I think even the most well-intentioned parents are going to probably leave some scars on their children. It's because, and the hope is with every generation we get a little bit healthier. But I think that, as conscientious as I've been with my own kids, certainly with my older son, I was newly sober and kind of figuring out how to be an adult and made so many mistakes, but what I learned from my mom is that when I messed up, I didn't like try to justify it or put it on him or deny that something happened. I've been able to apologize and sort of model what that behavior looks like the way
Right.
my mom did for me. I mean, through her own therapy and stuff, that's why she was able to sit in a room with me and let me unload on her about how I felt and listen and not get defensive.
Yeah.
And it's a really, it's a valuable skill as a parent.
It's tough. I had something recently with my oldest, and I had to kind of do the same. And I did the best I could to own it and remind him, I'm only as old a parent as you are alive.
Right.
And I'm human and I'm flawed. And,
Yeah.
both my kids are very aware of my alcoholism, and we've
Mm-hmm.
talked openly about it. And, I've tried to depart. I'm a 12-step guy. I never asked you in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Did you 12-step?
I
And
did do the 12 steps. I'm not in a 12-step program anymore. It didn't ultimately end up being the right recovery
mm,
modality for me, but it certainly helped me and laid a foundation at the time. It's just not what I ultimately needed.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you, I want to know what
Mm-hmm.
did work for you.
Mm-hmm.
But that foundation, like you said, was
Mm-hmm.
really helpful for me to simply, own my actions. What's my part in this, and
Mm-hmm.
try to keep, open dialogue and communication.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'm a human. I don't want that responsibility of any kind of
Right.
perfection in any way. So yeah, it's a real challenge. But I've kind of been exploring things outside of just the 12 step rules.
Mm-hmm.
What was it then for you after maybe doing some exploration in the 12 steps that you did find sobriety or
It
solidity?
was really mental health support. And for me, I think so much of my addiction was based in trauma. And it was for me, using drugs was a maladaptive coping skill, right? I say in the book, and I've said all over the place that, like, heroin saved my life until it didn't. I was extremely suicidal when I first started using, and it was like the thing that was like, okay, this is going to help me get through this so I don't jump out the window. I'm
Right.
not suggesting that's a good coping skill for anyone, but it was what I found, right? That's how we all sort of lean on those maladaptive coping strategies, is because we don't have healthy ones. And the trauma, and then the trauma caused by that maladaptive coping mechanism, alters the neural pathways in our brain, right? So that, it's like a trigger response thing, which is why, the neural pathway in our brain, the second that we are in discomfort, pain, any sort of suffering, we want to go to that coping mechanism. What helped me immensely wasn't just talk therapy, but was implementing different forms of cognitive behavioral therapy
Mm.
in my life, so that I learned things to um to try to practice, so that my first impulse when I was in pain was not to go back to a drug, right? Because
Right.
I mean, the last few years, as you'll see as you get towards the end of the book, I mean, the end of my using, I was not even getting what I needed. I wasn't getting the release anymore at all. With every relapse, it wasn't even that, the last couple of relapses weren't even that dramatic. It was just that it just wasn't working.
Mm.
And uh, over time, I learned how to use those new coping skills to to stay in my body, to be in discomfort, whether that's emotional, mental, or physical. I don't mean pain, because like, if I have surgery, I take pain medication.
Right.
But
Uh,
it really, really it was life altering, and it didn't happen overnight.
yeah.
And, I was fortunate enough that I had access to medical care. I had access to, you know, see a psychiatrist, get on medication that I had resisted for so long, because when I was trying to stay sober, some people were like, oh, if you take, for me, it was Wellbutrin. They're like, oh, that you're not really sober. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. And
Right.
I just think, my thinking on that is completely different now. But I had so many conflicted feelings about psychiatric medication. I had so much fear of being, way more fear around being called crazy than being called a junkie.
Yeah. That being ostracized, I think, prevents a lot of people from just simply saying, I need help, let alone
Yeah,
forget what we can get. You and I, it's both a hot button for us is just a support system of a
right.
ill society. But yeah, just that I need help, and being like, I've seen it with people I know that their family,
Mm-hmm.
like, there's nothing wrong. You don't need that. And it's like,
Right. Oh, I mean, that was much, very much like, when for the first time I went to rehab, there was very much like, oh, you're not like these people, Erin, like from my family. And it's people do that again, because it's like, it forces them to confront things that they don't want to confront. So, for me, it was cognitive behavioral therapy, learning to process that trauma that I
mhm,
had never processed,
mhm,
and then time, so, like, as I practiced new coping skills, those neural pathways, the good thing about the brain is it's extremely elastic. So you really kind of retrain your brain. I mean, I don't, you know, in March it'll be 20 years since I've taken drugs, and other than as prescribed for surgeries and things. I never thought that that was a possibility for me, and it's truly like I don't have cravings. I don't have, I don't get triggered. I mean, in New York, like, it's not uncommon that, like, I see somebody shooting up on the street. Like, it does not trigger me in any way at all. But it takes that time. And I think that it's also, when we're newly in recovery, it takes some time for sort of like homeostasis to come back just in your body systems. And then it's retraining those neural pathways. And truthfully, the 12 steps are a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just that I think in my case, and for many people, they have larger mental health issues, more trauma than non-medical professionals, not that your peers and like a sort of simple cognitive behavioral program can fix.
Yeah.
And I think that's why there's such a high rate of relapse. And, I like a broken record with it, but the more money we put into subsidizing mental health, long-term mental health programs for people in recovery, the higher success rates we're going to have, because
Absolutely.
they really, I mean, rehab's great, but that's not what's going to keep you sober. That's just about detoxing and like being in like sort of like a little bit of a bubble for a short period of time.
Yeah.
I didn't, I mean, I went to rehab twice, but when I finally got it, I detoxed with the help of a doctor, and over the course of 7 days. And then I, had a lot of mental health care for years. Still do.
As do I.
Right.
It's necessary to keep, because at the end of the day, we're the gatekeepers of ourselves. And, and that's a good place to be. Like you were saying, and for me, where I'm at is sometimes we've got to step, or not sometimes, it's inevitable. We got to step out the safety of the anonymous room, or the rehab, or the sober living, or whatever it is. And, what helped me stumble onto your work was the passion about, I'm not calling people sick, and I don't want to twist your words, but there is a lot of ill that is out there. And I'm so disheartened by what's my words? Sorry, I'm gonna curse. No fucking
That's
effort
right.
to really just have a look and realize that if you politicians that say all these things and promise this stuff and everybody, it's like, why can't you see this? Like, I don't know why addiction isn't more treated like a mental illness that takes long-term recovery. That, people, you're an example, I'm an example. So many people, you and I know examples of being at the depths of despair to dying multiple times, that you can come back for this, but we're some of the fortunate ones.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is, like I said, I mean, it was infinitely, I started the first time I took a drug, I was 8 years old. By age 13, I was shooting up, and I had 15 years of addiction, most of it completely hidden. Right. So even with all the resources that I had social support, I had family support, I had financial support. It still took me a really long time to get to a place where I could stay in recovery. And when you add on further obstacles, be they racial, socioeconomic, cultural, the difficulty in maintaining recovery just amplifies, and so I think that we really need to recognize that. The good thing is that there is movement in terms of how we're treating addiction. A big part of what I do is advocacy and lobbying for drug policy reform, increased access to medicated assisted treatment. And we spend so much money on the war on drugs. And if we put the money into treating people who are actually suffering in both preventative ways and in restorative ways, we would spend half of what we spend on this like never ending, monster of this mythical monster of like the drug supply. It's, the drug supply is there because of the need for people who are suffering.
Yeah, if
And
there's no demand,
exactly.
there's nothing to produce.
So it's just it's completely like throwing money out the window, because
Yeah.
they will always find a new way to get drugs in cheaper, faster. And that's just the reality. And
Yeah.
so I really think that even for people, regardless of political affiliation, if you want to look at it just from a pure economic standpoint, there is data on sort of like the cost of the opioid epidemic, for example. The cost of the opioid epidemic doesn't begin and end with the person using opioids. There is a trickle down effect generationally to their family members, to their children, to the lost wages, to lost future wages because, say, the parent dies. I mean, there is such a staggering economic cost to all of us. Everybody, it's this mindset of like, we have to stop thinking that social support systems are giving free money away to people. That's not what it is. It's the same thing. I mean, I could argue for days about this with like with just healthcare in general. The less we spend on healthcare, we think, oh, I don't want to spend my money, my tax dollars, because for that guy over there. Well, guess what? By not doing that, you're going to end up on the back end paying more in your insurance premiums, your medication costs, and on and on and on. Yeah. Whereas if we put a little bit more in upfront, we would all be saving money,
Yeah.
And I think that there are some people who see it that way, but it's so much of like what dictates policy is power.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I hope will change with time. I mean, the good and bad part about the drug crisis reaching sort of every facet of every type of American is that it's a bipartisan issue. In sort of my talks with legislators and their legislative aides, there is, this is completely a bipartisan issue. There's no challenge for me in reaching out to both parties and getting them to listen. And there is a marked turn toward greater harm reduction, because of the economic cost of the overdose crisis.
Are you primarily speaking with legislators in the state of New York, or are we talking nationally?
No, Congress. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know for me, all the work is pretty isolated to not only California, but Central California. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have a lot of, as much people that are in it. It's my favorite analogy is it's the great white shark in Jaws. And until it comes up and bites one of their family members in the ass, a lot of them aren't going to get to action. And I feel for them in that way. I hope that's not the case. I don't want that for anybody.
Right.
You've lost too many people. I've lost too many people to this disease of addiction. And it's disheartening. Let me ask you this. I haven't been able to ask someone this, about our safe supply approach and everything. My understanding, because I've talked with people in Canada, which Canada sounds like they've totally screwed it up because they wanted to model after Portugal. That's shown some really good success and results. Where do you see where we're at in the United States? Are we doing a good job at looking at some of those other countries that have also done a great job?
I mean, I don't know that we're doing a good job nationally. I'd say, in New York City, where I live, we are the first city in the country to have safe injection sites. So that means that, people can go there to use drugs safely. There are trained medical professionals there in case there is an overdose. They have all of the regular like harm reduction services, such as like clean needles and fentanyl testing strips. And there is also a pathway through these organizations to get on medicated assisted treatment. And they have been, very, very successful. I'm not a huge fan of the mayor of New York right now, but I will give him this. He went to visit the safe injection site and uh, was really impressed with what he saw. And like on International Overdose Awareness Day was part of the effort to hand out naloxone to people in fentanyl testing strips. And you know, in the state of New York, you know, there are a lot of states like this, but some naloxone and fentanyl testing strips are considered drug paraphernalia, which is ridiculous. State of New York, you can take like an online training course. I made my teenager do it. And you get trained how to administer naloxone. They send you a naloxone kit with accreditation so that you have liability insurance. So I think here we're seeing, and the initial numbers on these like increased harm reduction services are good. You know, it's hard to show the data until this has been implemented for some time. But, you know, I've spoken to countless parents in the tri-state area this year from, you know, upper middle class families who've lost a minor child to a fentanyl overdose, accidental fentanyl overdose. We may not want our children to try drugs. I think most of us, you know, that's not our wish for them. But the reality is that there's a high likelihood, you know, I'm part of Generation X, 80% of Gen Xers tried cocaine, right? So, you know, in high school or college or their 20s, whatever. So I think that number's actually gone down quite a bit. But if you look at like the number of people who try something at some point in their life, the problem is that there could be fentanyl in it. And, you know, on a street dealer level, they don't know that there's, you know, fentanyl in it. We had it was a really highly publicized thing where a few different professionals in the New York area all died from fentanyl overdoses on the course of like a weekend. And the dealing delivery service that they used, didn't know there was fentanyl in it, realized there was fentanyl in it. And part of how they caught the dealers was because they had been frantically trying to reach these clients to tell them that they had discovered that there was fentanyl in the cocaine. You know, no one is going to recover if they're dead, right? That's like the bottom line of harm reduction. It's to reduce harm. So I think that we can look at sort of the success of these pilot programs in a place like New York, and you know, any major city has way more access to harm reduction. It's really rural areas that probably suffer the most. Now I can't even remember what your question was. Oh, it was about like, what do we think in terms of what we're doing here?
Yeah.
Now with under the Biden administration, with the new drug czar, who originally was not pro harm reduction, completely pivoted. And they are like, one of the things that's up for legislation is an increased access to medication assisted treatment. Good. Which I think is phenomenal, because during the pandemic, when they started allowing people to take home methadone, or to more easily access buprenorphine based medications, which are all, you know, used for people who have substance use disorders related to opioids, they did not see any increase. They saw a decrease in sort of like using drugs while on medicated assisted treatment. They saw a decrease in overdoses. They saw a decrease in relapse. The data is there, right? As much as we may not think that that's the right way to do it, who cares? Like, you want people, the ultimate goal is we want people to live and we want people to recover. So if these evidence-based methods are effective, we should implement them. And that's definitely sort of what the movement that's happening around sort of federal legislation. It's not happening fast enough, but it's happening, which is why I keep talking to legislators.
Well, we got to. And thank you. No, because for me, opioids wasn't the issue. People always laugh like, I pop Vicodin and other things. Right. I had that first time sickness and it's like, yeah, not for me. My brain, cocaine. No, thank you. I'm paranoid enough as is.
Right.
So, I don't have that experience. I've never
Mm-hmm.
had to step into a methadone clinic. I don't know that
Right.
experience. So, I've got to ask people that have been there. You've been there. And the one thing I am curious about, and I hope we get there, and from my understanding of like what Portugal did, it's, the talk of decrim. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of people, is it that they didn't decriminalize it, but the difference was you didn't go to jail, you
Mm-hmm.
went to treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And do you
I
think we're
mean,
getting that movement going? That
I
it's
mean,
like,
we ish certainly. I mean, that's like even just with like sort of drug court, right? That's the whole purpose of
sure.
drug court is to defer, to instead of sending somebody to jail, we send them to treatment. I have mixed feelings about court mandated treatment because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how high the success rates are through our drug court system. One of the things, I'll find it later and send it to you, is there was a big write up in the New York Times Sunday magazine earlier this year. There's a drug court in New Mexico where the judge has changed the way the drug court program works there in this one district, so that because in drug courts now, like if somebody has like a dirty test, they get kicked out of the program. You do not get kicked out of the program there. You just have to keep participating because relapse is a high probability, especially for people who are opioid users. So instead of kicking them out of the program, it's like, no, let's get them back on, okay, we acknowledge it, we continue the treatment, we
Yeah.
adjust what we need to adjust, and for anyone who looks at addiction and alcoholism from like a disease model perspective, if somebody was being treated for cancer and one treatment protocol didn't work, the doctors wouldn't say, well, sorry, we're not going to treat you because that treatment protocol didn't work, so you're screwed.
Yeah.
We're going to, here's a death sentence.
Yeah.
They would say, okay, what other options are there? Let's try this. And we need to
Exactly.
have the same approach with treating addiction. If something is not working for that individual, this is not a moral issue. There could be a number of reasons that it doesn't work,
Yeah.
including the fact that, as I said, your brain's neural pathways are changed by trauma and addiction, and it takes a certain amount of time and cognitive behavioral therapies to reroute those neural pathways.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it's such common sense stuff, but I think that like so many things in terms of legislature, people like to put sort of a moral hierarchy into how we view things, and everything becomes very black and white. Or they throw some sort of religious bent into it, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
There's no evidence in that sort of thinking.
Yeah. Well, and it's really dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I was reading something, a neuropsychologist was talking about that, neural pathways, and
Mm-hmm.
their sole focus was just the brain and treating
Mm-hmm.
the brain. It's like, well, you got to treat this is a whole being. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
about you, Erin. I'm fortunate. I got all my limbs and
Right.
stuff works. It's like this is a whole thing, let alone, I've made parallels for people like the troubled kid at school. How
Mm-hmm.
effective was sending that kid home? What if his home was
Yeah,
the environment that
exactly.
was clearly, normally it is, especially with little kids, it's like it doesn't work. We
I
can't
was
just go like,
No.
you're suspended. Here's your punishment. We're not going to help you anymore. What does that tell them? So they've already. So let's take the 25. Let's take a 25-year-old who's probably been most likely failed at home, or at least some traumas.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not on purpose. My parents, it wasn't on purpose, but
Yeah, same. Yeah.
yeah, here it happened. Maybe they had trouble in school too. So two institutions have failed them. So you've got a third one, and you're just going to tell them, "Yep, you're not good enough." Bye.
Right.
I've got a real problem with that.
Yeah. And I mean, I was watching something recently where somebody was talking about parenting, and that like they were talking about like behavior, right? Behavioral issues, and how often, behavior is communication, right? So when a child acts out, they're communicating something that they don't know how to express through words. They're telling us that they are communicating something through that behavior. it's the same thing as people grow up, because how many adults do we know, and I'll include myself in this, when I was younger, who have no emotional regulation skills or poor at best, right? So they act like children. And it's the same thing when people have behavior that is atypical or behavior that's problematic, generally speaking, with some, exceptions, few exceptions, they are communicating something. A person who is healthy and well-adjusted doesn't act out in those ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I've experienced it recently in my home, unfortunately.
Oh.
But hey, that's part of it. But I like I've especially my youngest and talk to them, and it's like, hey, be glad your dad went through did, because I'm all about therapy, and my
Right.
youngest is on board with it. And matter of fact,
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, can I do this more frequently? I
Right.
don't think every other week is enough
Right.
for the issues there. So um
And as parents, it's not like we're going to do it perfect. Like I said, it's not like I do it perfectly now. Even with like 20 years of recovery, I still make mistakes.
sure.
I'm just, they're not as big, and I'm much quicker to correct them, right?
Right.
That's the biggest difference. But the good news about that is that, like, thank goodness I do make mistakes, because my kids get to see me model like what happens when we make a mistake.
Yeah.
Does the world end? No.
Yeah.
We take responsibility for it, and we say, okay, next time I'm going to do that, and I'm going to show you that next time I'm going to do that, I'm going to handle it differently.
Yeah, it's called not being a narcissist.
Right.
So accepting a little responsibility here, which is still tough. Do you still have sometimes swallowing that pill, going, "Damn it, okay, that is on me. It's time to make an amends," or are you pretty
I think
right?
I'm pretty good about accepting responsibility now. I mean, I was talking to my husband about something recently, and he had said, like, say he even like said something like that. He's like, oh no, he's like, you're so quick to, like, you know, you're so quick to like adjust. Like I might say something that's like, like a jab or something, and then I stop, and I, go back and then acknowledge that that's not even what I meant, and that I said it because of, XYZ. And I think that I probably spent like so much time in discomfort trying to like force the thing that wasn't right, or the thing that wasn't working, that now I just know the relief that comes with like taking ownership and correcting course. Because it's that thing of like, like, I don't know, this that saying, like, eventually the bill will always come. I'd rather pay the bill and not have that like underlying anxiety about it.
Yeah,
Because even if we try and push things like that away, it's there in the back of our head somehow, and
yeah.
causing anxiety. So I am, I'm so much happier being able to own up to things quickly.
I tell me if you've had this, and I think it's the importance to share too, about even making an apology and
Mm-hmm.
an amends or behavior correction. Is I had two situations. One, the nonprofit I work at, wonderful lady that works there,
Mm-hmm.
younger lady, and she always seems to have some car troubles. And the way it came out of my mouth
Mm-hmm.
afterwards, I was like, oh, that was kind of a little bit demeaning, maybe a little bit
Right.
sexist. And I, took her aside, apologized. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I didn't take it that way at all. But it was the relief of my conscience
Yeah.
that I felt like that, and I didn't want that relationship to be there. And I had
Right.
another situation of a buddy, asking me, about certain stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
somebody that I had to get away from, but he still has a connection to. And I just call him like, hey, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to like gaslight you, change your opinion of this person, but
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of inquisitive. And he's like, no, bro, like, hey, it's we're friends. This is trust our space. This stays between us. I'm not gonna go, well, do you know what Jason said? And
Right.
but he's like, I didn't take it that way at all. I just was being a friend so you could vent. But again, for me to be able to be like, ooh, I didn't fully get that out, or that might have been misconstrued, for someone that I value, it is so important for me now.
Right.
Yeah, because I don't want that interest either.
No, I mean, it's like, I also just find that like when I clear that stuff out, it just leaves so much more room to create, to enjoy my life,
Yeah.
to be able to be present. Because when I have something like that nagging me in the back of my head, it it affects my focus, it affects my ability to be present.
Yeah, same. Well, Erin, I got so many different things, so hopefully we'll do this again. My plan
Sure.
here too is get multiple people on so we could do some discussionary type of
Yeah.
things more too. So keep up the amazing work. Tell people where to find the book. Ask Erin how to find you on social media, and then we're going to jump into some random questions.
Sure. So you can find me on my website, erinkhar.com. My advice column is Ask Erin. It's at askerin.substack.com. And I'm at Erin Khar on all social media. The book is available wherever books are sold, independent bookstores, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and all the rest.
Yeah, the Audible is really good too, folks, by the way.
Yeah, I love that. I didn't do the narration, but I love the narrator.
Yeah, no, at first I was trying to figure out if he's like, no, but she gets you.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the mannerisms, and there's certain language
Mm-hmm.
you even use in there that's very like ew, and she does such
Right.
a wonderful job. So if you're like me and an audiobook person, get the audiobook. It's just a phenomenal book. All right, Erin, random questions. These are
Okay.
just for fun because I like to wrap up with something more lighthearted. Being that it is a wonderful book, and who knows, maybe people have already reached out about making a movie or a TV series
Mhm.
out of it, because I see it here. Who would you want to play adult you?
Well, I can't really say right now because it's currently in development.
Oh, I nailed it. All right. Hey, if you need a tall, slender guy, hit me up. I'm a hell of an actor. Well, the first time I've had to table that question. So I'm looking forward to it. Keep me in the loop on that. That'll be awesome. Yeah, it has to be a series, though. I'm just saying
Hmm.
it has to be a
Yeah,
series.
it
'Cause,
is.
I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
just the movement through your childhood and everything. It's like, oh gosh, yeah. It's one of those. I'm such a visual person, and again, to tout the book gave me such a wonderful visual. I could smell when you're talking about the hay when you're horse
right.
riding, and all those things. Anyways, all right, you're stranded on a deserted island. You have
Uh-huh.
one movie with you and one music artist greatest
Oh
hits.
my gosh, that's really hard. One movie?
Uh-huh.
God, I don't know. It's really hard to pick one. Okay. Okay, let's do the music first. I think that I would probably pick David Bowie.
Okay.
That was the first thing that popped into my head, but it could be any other number of artists who I love too for the music. And then for the film, oh my gosh, I think if I was stranded with only one film, it would have to be a comedy. um I don't know why this is so hard. This is going to sound so silly. So I don't know why I'm picking something that I watched over and over again when I was a kid.
Uh,
And I haven't even watched it in years, but for some reason this is what popped into my head. When I was a kid, I used to record movies like on VHS from like cable, right? And
right.
one of the ones that I recorded was Mel Brooks' History of the World
I
because
love
it's
it.
so funny and so silly. And I'm sure like there's a lot in there that's probably not politically correct today, but it's so funny. And I don't know. That would be
Uh,
one of the possibilities.
it's it's the hard thing. Like as a movie fan, and I love Mel Brooks too. Is like Blazing Saddles. I love that movie, but
Oh, could
some
not be
people,
made. No.
yeah, there's so
History of
many,
the World isn't that controversial, but
right?
it's so funny. But yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's hard. Like there's so many films that I love, but some of them aren't necessary. I would want if I could only have one film, it would have to be something funny.
All right. Did you ever see Kentucky Fried Movie? John Landis?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so it's like an adult Saturday Night Live early
Yeah.
80s, and I'm like, oh yeah, there's no way that could be made
No.
today.
Oh, there's a lot of films that couldn't be made today.
Right. Well, they could be made, but they would face a lot of backlash for sure. Oh, that's funny. The funny thing too about in your book is like your musical taste. I'm like, if we were the same age and I grew up in LA, we probably would have been homies.
Right.
Yeah. All right. You could have dinner with any one person, living or not. Who are they?
Oh God, these are such hard questions. Okay. See, there's people who I really admire, but I'm like, who would be really funny?
Right.
I always go back to that. Who would be really funny? I think I would be happy to have dinner with like any of the writers who were part of the Algonquin Roundtable, Dorothy Parker, Robert Benchley, James Thurber, one of those writers, because they were so quick-witted and dry and dark.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah, people I got asked one time about in an interview if you could play any character or any person from history and play them. I was like, Edgar Allan Poe. They're like, oh, you're dark. I'm like, well, I was kind of a depressed teenager.
Right.
So it worked. Last one before I leave you with the final thoughts. I love this question. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
I think it would be the power to like stop time. And I don't mean like indefinitely, but like if I could stop time in specific moments to like feel that moment for even like a couple more minutes, I think that would be pretty amazing.
That's pretty. No one's ever said that. I love it. I love it. Yeah. All right, Erin. This is such a pleasure. I just love the work you're doing. It's nice to have been able to make your acquaintance, and hopefully there's something we'll be able to work on outside of this space to as I grow in my advocacy. What might you want to share with people? Maybe it's the addict struggling, a family member, a loved one, or people that just listen to this podcast to become informed.
I mean, I think it's sort of like I always go back to my primary message about addiction, that it's not a moral failing, that addiction is an example of a human being struggling with a very human condition.
This is the Knockin' Doorz Down podcast, featuring celebrities, experts, and everyday people who have overcome adversities, including addiction, mental health, and trauma, to live purposeful lives. And that's what Knockin' Doorz Down is all about.
This podcast contains the views and opinions of the Knockin' Doorz Down hosts and their guests to the show. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. The content here is for informational purposes only. And because each person is sharing their unique perspective, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast and website are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. Privacy is of the utmost importance to us. For those wishing anonymity, people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect confidentiality at the request of certain guests. This website or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship. If you find any errors in any of the content of this podcast or blogs, please send a message through the contact page. This podcast is owned by KDD Media Company.